Boker Tov. Today's daf is Daf Yud Beis and Shavuos as we learn for Achenu Kol Beis Yisrael and Asuna Matzar Shivya. Yesterday we discussed in great detail the sheet of Rabbi Yochanan, who explains the machlokas between the Rabbanan. We don't know who the Rabbanan are, but the Rabbanan and Rab Shimon. Rabbi Yochanan says that according to Rabbanan, Leiv Bezin Masna Lane. So if you have extra karbonos at the end of the year and you have to bring the karbonos in the new year, meaning from the Rosh Chodesh Nisan, from the new monies. So what you could do is you could simply transfer over their kedusha, right? You could transfer over the kedusha and say you don't really have to transfer the kedusha. Bezin originally stipulates that if they're not needed, you can use them for some other purpose. So you don't have to wait till they get a mum or anything like that. That's the sheet of the Chachamim. Reb Shimon doesn't agree. He doesn't hold of lei bezin masna leim. So he says you can't just say that the kedusha is removed and now use them for something else. Doesn't work that way, but rather what does Rav Shimon hold? So in the 11th line of Daf Yud Beis Aleph that we said those lines yesterday, but we'll repeat them. Rav Shimon in the 11th line on Daf Yud Beis Aleph. Rav Shimon the less of the best mouse. He doesn't hold to that. What do you do with those karbonos at the end of the year? You're right. They can't be brought as the carbon tumid for the new year without changing, without getting a mum and redeeming them, etc. But what you could do is, okay, they're carbonot olas. You can't bring them as a carbon tamid. Just use them for filling in. Makitzin the mezbech is like a lotion of dessert, like the best when mezbech is not so busy, so you bring it as a carbonola at that time. Amar Rav Shmuel bar Rav Yitzchak, u'moda Rav Shimon is moda that even though the carbonos ola, remember we said the carbon tamid, you set aside 6 carbonos every day. The last of the year you use 2, the other 4 extra. What do you do with them? Well, according to the Chachamim, lei bezin maslan, if you don't need them, they're no longer designated as carbonos for carbon tamid, and you could bring them for anything. You could use them for whatever you need. So that was the shita that we had back actually in Daf Yud that we talked about when we first mentioned the idea of lei bezin masna lein. Right? Or was it mentioned on Daf Yud Aleph? No, I think we had it already. Yeah, no, it was on Yud Aleph. We had the first question. Ulam Rabbi Yochanan had said that if you don't need them, you could be po to them tamimim. Just po to them the way they are. Why? Because lei bezin masna. In other words, you could just use them for some other purpose without them getting a mum. You could transfer their kedusha without a mum. Why? Because lei bezin masna leim. Okay, so that was the sheet of the Rabbanan. Reb Shimon says no. You didn't know lei bezin masna leim. You can't change them without getting a mum. However, you could use them for another ola. Just don't bring it as a carbon tummy. You could bring it as stam as an ola, like dessert for the mizbeach. Amar Shmuel bar Yitzchak, u'marav shem mesir chatas. Let's say you had a sar v'chatas shem mekitzin dam gufa and elbin. Let's say you had an extra chatas carbon. Chatas carbon you can't use as an ola on the mizbeach, right? Stam. Right, there is moda. Besir chatas she'em mekitzin b'gufa, you can't use them elbin, meaning you have to let them get a mum and transfer the kedusha and use it that way. But you can't. An ola can be used as an ola, even though it's not a tamid. Maybe it was originally a tamid. Now it's no longer a tamid. It's still an ola. But you can't change a carbon chatas and then use it as an ola. All right, a carbon what? Like a nedava? No, we're talking about a carbon sibur over here. We're talking here about a carbon sibur, a carbon of a yachad of an individual that you give as an adava, that you have to get a mum first. Everybody agrees you have to get a mum first, and exchange the kedusha onto money, and then let's say money, and then buy another carbon with it. An adava, when you say you use it as an adava, if you mean for a tzibur, yeah, but then that's the question: do you have to transfer the kedusha first or not? If it's even Rav Shimon who says he doesn't hold the lei bezin masna leim, but he still says yes, an ola could be used as an ola, but a chatas cannot be used as an ola. Chatas can be used without transferring the kedusha properly by getting a mum first. That's the Rav Shimon siri chatas she'em makitzim begufin el b'dameim. Right, hacha here in the case of ola hu mikar ola v'hashtrol. In the case of the extra karbonos tamid that you have at the end of the year, it was an ola originally. Now it's still an ola. Then you could just use it for dessert on the mizbeach. But over there where it was first a chatas, and then you can't use it as an ola, you can't do that gzeira. Not that technically you couldn't, but it's gzeira la'achar kapar to lefnei kapar. We're afraid that once you can't use it anymore, what do you mean achar kapara? You had a chatas, a sar of a chatas, like we talked about, either a carbon sibur of a avodah zarah or the chatas that he brings on Yom Kippur. It was a chatas, and it got lost, and they brought another one in its place, and now you find the original one. So lachar kapara, you really could use the chatas and use it as an ola, as dessert from this mizbeach. But we're afraid if you allow that, you'll come to use it even before the kapara. Even before, you might just say, "Oh, here's the regular carbon chatas that you brings on Yom Kippur or avodah zarah at Tzibur, and we'll use it as an ola instead, even though you didn't get a kapara yet." So therefore, aval hasam to mikara chatas v'hashno. Now, originally it was a chatas. Now you want to make it an ola. We make exera lachar kapara atul lefnei kapara because we're afraid you might use it before kapara, and that would be improper. So therefore, even Rav Shimon, who says you could use an ola, like a tamid, at the end of the year, just use it for dessert from mizbeach. That's only by a chatas. That's only by an ola, not by a chatas that you want to use now as an ola. But yes, the lashon of yiplu nedava, you are right. The nedava is normally what an individual gives, but the nedava could also be as a tzibur, as we're going to see later on. The yiplu nedava, when an animal becomes it's achar kapara, it doesn't have any use anymore. You could get it. Wait till it gets a mum and redeem it, and then use that money to buy an ola as an adava, but it would be an adava for the tzibur, really, technically, as we'll see. Amar Abaya, I see the same idea here, that a chatas cannot be used as an ola, even if the chatas is not needed anymore. Tanina, parvasar shel Yom Kippur. We had this case yesterday. Parvasar shel Yom Kippur, the par and the sar that the coin brings on Yom Kippur. These are both carbon chatas. She'avdu, that got lost. And they used other ones. They designated other ones in their place, and then these were found later on after the other ones were used in their place. If the tzibur committed avodah zarah, they bring a carbon sawyer. Shavdi got lost. They brought another one in its place. Kulan yamusu div Rav Meir. Rav Meir says, now what do you do with these extra carbon chatas? They all die. Why do they die? What do you do with them? It's a chatas that you can't use. It's a chatas shekipru ba'aleh, right? These are kabbanos chatas that they already had a kapara. The chatas shekipur baleh is one of the 5 cases that you let the chatas die. That's what this is too. Reb Lezer, Reb Shimon Omer, no. Yirachi yistavu v'yimachru demein lenadava shein chatas sibur mesa. There's no such thing as the owner having died or having a kapara, because this is the tzibur. The tzibur doesn't die. Shein chatas sibur mesa, right? A chatas sibur you never let die because the tzibur is always around. Rashi says here. Rashi says. He doesn't bring it. He doesn't. There's no Rashi on these words, but we had it yesterday. Mesa. Rashi on yesterday's Daf Amid Beis says Rashi says, if you look in Rashi about 12 lines down from the top of yesterday's page Amid Beis, the time of Masisin low cover regular cover is there. You can't bring carbon of Yom Kippur on next Yom Kippur. He says this is called Yamusu. This is like chatas shemesu ba'aleh, right? Or shekipur ba'aleh. The owner already had a kapara, and you have this extra chatas. You let it die. Then Reb Shimon said this. I'm saying Reb Shimon said shein chatas sibur mesa lo nemar alocha dechamesh mas ela b'yochid. That's the idea here. That as we said, the chatas sibur, the chatas that we say the 5 chatas you let die is only by a chatas of a yochid, but not by a tzibur. Shein chatas sibur mesa, the chatas of tzibur you don't let die. The halacha l'mosh misin about is only by a yochid, but not by a tzibur, because a tzibur never really dies or doesn't.
Pardon? Is there confusion here of 2 different categories? That you have chatat shekipu ba'aleh,
right? And right. So here it's the same thing. It's only by just like we find. You're right. There are 2. It's 5 different categories of chatas, 5 different cases. But here there's 2. No, because just like by chatas, he says since it doesn't apply in one, it doesn't apply in the others either. That's his idea. That you don't have the concept of halacha mashmi sinai, that on those 5 cases you'll die are only of a yachid. Why? Because you can't have. One of the cases is chatas shemesu ba'aleh, right? You can't have that by a tzibur. And they've never died. So the same thing over here. Shein chatas sibur mesa. The chatas sibur also doesn't die. Because why? Because since it doesn't apply in one, it doesn't apply in the others also. Says the Gemara. So we're still trying to prove. How do you see this case that Reb Shimon is moda over here? That the chatas that's extra you can't use as an ola for the dessert for the Mizbeach. Mamai nikvu inu gufayu. Why do you say that the Tanakama says they all die because chatas shemeis baleh? He doesn't hold to that comparison, right? He holds it's a chatas shekipru baleh, and you let it die like every other case, right? He says muso, and that's like you said. Rashi said yesterday. Rashi says this is like chatas shekipru baleh, and therefore you let it die. Rabbi Elazar, Rab Shimon say no, you let it get a mum first, and then you wait till it gets a mum. And you sell it, people do an adava, and their value is brought as an adava. You're right. This is an adava of a tzibur because we're talking about a tzibur. Adava could be a tzibur. Shein chatz tzibur mesa. Why do you say you have to let it get a mum and then redeem it and bring another one in its place and bring an ola in its place? Why don't you bring these chatos themselves as an ola? You see here also so you see that Rav Shimon holds this. All these are proofs that Rav Shimon is moda, even though he says that he doesn't hold of lay bes and masna land. So you can't just you can't just transfer the kedusha easily to something else, bring something else in its place, right? It's like we said, according to Ula and Rabbi Yochanan, different people keep it the way they are. Just say fine as they are. Take their be poted without getting a mum, transfer over to some other carbon. According to Rav Shimon, he doesn't say that, but he does say that you could use that extra ola at the end of the year and bring it as an ola, but only if it's originally an ola. If it's a chatas, you can't, because Xer lachak apart till snake apara. Amarav and Rav says another proof. I have another proof. Vasheni Yirachi Yistov on Yom Kippur. There are two seirim which are designated, right? One for the outer carbon, the chatos, and one for Lazazel, right? The scapegoat. Now, let's say you designated two of them, and the scapegoat that you said died. It just died, had a heart attack before you were able to send it out, right? Just died. So what do? You got to take two more and designate from them one for Lazazel and one for Kodesh, one for the Mizbeach, right? Now you have two for the Mizbeach. The one from the original pair, and this one. So what do? One of them you bring as the carbon of Yom Kippur of the Chatas on the Mizbeach. Vasheni, the second one, let it get a mum. Yira, let it graze out Yistav, Yimacher, and sell it. People don't know from beginning. Vamai, Yikr v'Iu Gufeil. The same thing. Why don't you bring it itself as an Ola? Elav Shmaminak say Racha Kapatos make a par. So you said proof. Yet a further proof. Amravina Afanana Mitinina. We all these proofs that we say Xera. Gzera Amravina Afanana Mitanina. See this also here. Asham Shemesubal. Listen to this. An asham. Now listen carefully. An asham is always a carbon of an individual. There is no such thing as an asham of a tzibur, right? You have a chatas of a tzibur, you have an ol of a tzibur, right? But you don't have an asham. Asham is an individual sin offering. It's brought in 5 cases. We say that every day Hashem says, right? Let's say Shemei Sabala. Now, if the owner died, what do you do there? Ocean Balav, or he had a kapara with another carbon in its place. You lost this one, you found it up, you brought another one, and now you have an extra one. So the Tanakama says, Yirachi Yistov, you wait till it gets a mumbi macher, people davav, and you use the money for an adava. Now, this shita goes with the sheet of the general opinion of the Rabbanan, that are the 5 chatos that you let die. Remember the 5 chatos that die, 2 of which are what? Meisu balav or Kippur balav, right? Or Vlad chatos, or Tmuras chatos, or chatos she'abar shnasa, because it's only good the first year. So those 5 you let die if they're extras, right? You don't bring them. Well, Vlad chatos is even, if it didn't, Vlad chatos simply means you have a chatos here and it gave birth. The baby you can't bring as a carbon because it's a chatos, but it's not designated for anybody. You let it die. That's a case where, the other case is chatas she'ebra shnasa. It's too late. It passed its year. It's pag tokef, as we say in Hebrew, right? It's too late. It expired, right? The other ones, what do we say, are tmuras chatas. You bought a tmura. There's no such. You can't bring that as a carbon because you can bring a tmura of some other carbon you could bring, but not of a chatas, because a chatas is only for a sin. This isn't for a sin. You have the original for a sin. So in all these cases, you look at a mum. So this shita goes with the general shita that of the 5 chatos that you let die, if the same thing happened on an Asham, you let it get a mum and you bring another one in its place. You don't let the Asham die. Now, obviously, you can't have all five. Why? Because an Asham is always a Zachar. And we have a rule until modern times, males don't give birth, right? Males, whatever the species are, males don't give birth. No transgender. So they can't. So you can't have all five, right? One of the five is Vlad Chatos, right? You can't have a Vlad of an Osham, right? Okay, but let's say the other ones, Shekipru Balov, or the owner died. What do? Let it get a mum. That's what the Tanna Kamma says. You build a dava. Rabbi Lezer Amar Yamus. Rabbi Lezer holds. Rabbi Lezer has a famous sheet that we had at the beginning of Zvachim, if you remember, Michael, from 5 years ago. That the sheet that Rabbi Lezer holds that an Asham is like a Chatos. The Halacha L'Moshe Misinai, which says that these 5 Chatos, as you let die, apply to Asham also. In the cases where they apply, in the 4, let's say the 4 cases that can apply. So Rabbi Lezer says that you let it die. Okay. Rabbi Yeshua Omer, listen carefully. The 3 sheets here. That Chachamim, you let it get a moment, you let bring another one in its place as an adav. Rabbi Lezer says you let it die because there's like a Chatos. Like the 5 Lachamosh Mesinai of Chatos applies to Asham also. Rabbi Yeshua Omer, Yavi B'dam of Ola. You bring in its place an Ola. In other words, you also transfer the Kedusha, look at them. You bring it in its value. In other words, you let it get a mum and you exchange it. Now, isn't Rabbi Yeshua really the same as the Tanna Kamma? Both of them say you bring in a dava. So Rashi explains that nafkmin isn't a dava of a tzibur of an individual. The Tanna Kamma holds what? That it's of a tzibur. Therefore, there's no smicha of an individual, and the nesachim come from the tzibur. Whereas Rabbi Yeshua says yavi, he brings it b'dam of ola. Yavi b'dam of ola, meaning obviously if he died, he can't bring it. His children could bring it, but if he had a kapara already, he could exchange it and bring an ola with it. Why all that? The likra of who gufe ola, it should be who, not her. The likra of who. Why doesn't he bring it as an ola itself? Bring that asham as an ola. After all, an ola animal is similar to an asham in that they are both male. They're both male. Why don't you bring it as an ola? The answer is it's Notice in the cases of the chatos, Michael, that we're talking about a chatos which is a male. See, because a chatos of an individual is a female, kizbor asira, but of the Cohen, etc., that's a par. That's a par. A par is an ox, a male. Pardon? A seir or a seir, right? If it's a seir or if it's a par of a seir, right. Okay. Shema mina. So you see that whole idea. Tana mihachi. We see this also. What's the sign going on? This that we said that the extra karbonos in the stall in the base of Mikdash, the extra 4 animals, let's call them, that you have at the end of the year that were originally designated for the carbon tumid of evening and of morning and evening and afternoon, that you bring those tumid. If you have extra ones at the end, what do you do with them? So again, the Tanna Kamma said, okay, you just transfer the kedusha. You say this goes on to something else without getting a mum. Rav Shimon doesn't hold to that. Therefore, he says you use them for just use them as themselves for kitzam mizbech. You can't bring them as a chiyuv of a carbon. Just use them for dessert on mizbech. Tana me'achi. Mine nadiim. What do you bring from the extra karbanos at the end of the year? Right. So we say kayetz kibnos shuach. You bring like dessert, like dates, like nice white dates that you bring. Or figs, I guess they're really figs. You bring figs, like you bring something sweet at the end. You bring dessert. It's like dessert for the mizbeach. So Gemara says, what do you mean? As if you bring figs on the mizbeach, like it says, lo saktiru menu isha lashem. You can't bring yeast or dvash. Dvash means, of course, date honey, but it means anything sweet. Rashi says, chol dvash. Rashi in the 3rd line from the top of the page says, chol mine peiros ha'ilum b'chlal are included in that. So no, just like you go to eat somewhere, right? And they bring you dessert, something sweet at the end. Just like individuals have a sweet thing at the end. Here also, the carbanola is like a sweet thing for the mizbeach at the end. You bring them like a dessert, not as a regular chiyuv or anything like that. Tarish of Nachman Baruch Chisda. Listen to this. When we say over here that these karbanos sibur that you have at the end of the year or extra karbanos you bring them as dessert for the mizbeach. when you bring them for dessert, you can bring an ola, but you can't bring an ola sa'of. Can't bring a bird. Amarava, hi borcha. Where do you get this from? What does that mean? Like a davra body of where do you get this idea? Why can't you bring birds? I'll tell you why. My borcha. So why do you say it's like a silly thing that that it was improper to say that you can't do that? I said it. I said it myself. Rav Shimi ben Arda. I said it in the name of this famous Rav Shimi. Right? I told it to him. I told it to him. In other words, Nachman Yitzchak said this, and Rabbi said, "Where'd you get this from?" So Nachman Yitzchak says, "No, I told it. I said this, and I said it in the name of Rav Shimi from Narda. No, Rav Shimi Narda. Moses Nivras Sibor Asli. The extra things only go for Nivras Sibor. The Ein Ola Sa'ov Bit Sibor. There's no such thing as a bird when it comes to Sibor. A bird is only for individuals, either a Yoledes or a Metzora or a carbon oliviore, but there's no such thing when it comes to Sibor. So therefore, these extra ones that you don't bring when we say L'kitza Mizbeach, we say that cannot be a bird. And Rashi says here, exactly where Rashi says it, I didn't mark it. But Rashi says here, whenever it says here, he says, Rashi says on Amaralf, Chol Yiplu Nadav, the Kamer Rab Shimon, B'chol Duchta L'kitza Mizbeachu. Rashi says, whenever Rab Shimon says it goes for a Nadava, it means L'kitza Mizbeach. It means for dessert from the Mizbeach, and that it means, and according to this Rab Shimon Nadav, he says that it always comes with Nidva Sibur, not Nadava Stam. Vein also Sibur. Also, we said here, Rabbi Shua says Yavi the dam of Ola. So maybe some, if it's not, that's not a tzibur. If it's not for a tzibur, maybe you could bring a bird. When he talks about, and that keeps him we're talking about when you bring it as a dove of a tzibur, a carbon of a tzibur, that's if it's brought as a carbon tzibur, then it can't be from birds. Ba'af Shmuel says the Gemara. Ba'af Shmuel Savalad Rabbi Yochanan. Shmuel also is this Rabbi Yochanan. What did Rabbi Yochanan say? Rashi tells us that we're talking about one specific thing, this idea that Rabbi Yochanan said, Leil, that Tamid and Shalus Reb Shimon, the less Reb Shimon doesn't know best masnalei, and you use it for the dessert from his bech, and doesn't have to go out and go out in the pasture and get a mum and then exchange, but rather just use it as it is for dessert from his bech. Dam Rav Yudam Shmuel Karbonos Sibor Sakin Moshchoson Lamashahain. The knife, the chalif that the shochet uses in the mizbeach, that determines its use. That draws it to its use. Now, different farshim say that this memra of Rabbi Yochanan was only going on the chachamim who all lay bezin masnale. In other words, bezin could say, okay, if it wasn't designated for this, if it's not needed, you could use it for something else. And the knife, when you shecht it with your kavanah, then that will determine what it's for. Rashi doesn't learn that. Rashi says it's going on this that Rabbi Yochanan said the name of Rab Shimon, that if it's not needed, you could use it for kitzah mizbeach. And the chalif, when you shechted it, you change it from being as a carbon tamid, an ola tamid, to a regular ola that's used for dessert from the mizbeach. Tanya mihachi moder Rab Shimon the sawyer, shimlo karb regel, the sawyer, that's supposed to be bought as a musaf. And let's say you were supposed to bring it on Sukkot, right? That if you didn't bring it on Sukkot, you could bring it on Rosh Chodesh. So bring it on Rosh Chodesh Cheshvan. Vim lo karav, you didn't bring it on Rosh Chodesh, you could bring Kippur. You could bring it next year in Yom Kippur. Vim lo karav Yom Kippur, you could beregel. So bring it on another regel. Vim lo karav beregel, you could beregel acher. Shemetchilos lo bo el chapam mizbeach achitzon, because it was always for some carbon, a similar carbon on the mizbeach achitzon. And Rashi points out, what do you mean? Just like we say that Reb Shimon said, when they asked him, how can you bring one carbon for another? Don't forget, they saw, even according to Reb Shimon, the Rosh Chodesh is machaper for tahar shachos, a tamei, and regalim is machaper for lo yedi v'tchil lo yedi sof, and Yom Kippur is machaper for lo yedi v'tchil v'yesh yedi b'sof. The answer is it's all for tumas mikdash for kachov, and that's what Rashi explains over here too. Rashi says moda Reb Shimon, Rashi divrei mas Reb Shimon a little bit above the Bach. Umaskana the time we lost the boy el chapel mizbeach alma ahodu kapira shika mizbeach chitzon lechaper mixes davar shuk tishlo. Something was mikdash chatas to mikdash to cover to mikdash v'af bishen kabras and shava hachanami laol shuk tishlo yikra. That's what he's saying over here, that the idea that Marub Shim Basar Shim Lo Karbazeh is similar, that at least it's something similar. You bring it for some kind of Tumas Mikdash. You bought it for some kind of Mikdash. And the same thing here, when it was originally an Ola for the carbon Talmud, it's still used as an Ola. It's a a different kind of an Ola. It's an Ola that's dessert Ola, that's just stam used on the Mizbeach, but at least it's similar in some way. So as long as it's similar, the sakin, the knife, can use it. However, we said before, you don't take a chatas and use that as an Ola for Kitzur Mizbeach, because we're afraid that even though the sakin could change it, but we're afraid that you might come to you to bring the chatas as an Ola before the kapara. If the chatas was designated for a certain sin, and you didn't have kapara in it yet, you can only use it for that. You can't use it for an ola. The Mishnah said.
Isn't it possible that this animal was over Shana?
Yeah. So again, so here's the idea. When you're using it in this case, you're right. If it went from Yom Kippur, if it went from Rosh Chodesh to Yom Kippur, right? You'd have that problem, right? You'd have that problem. You could use it for the next year. But again, it's not, it could be that the answer is this, that it's designated already for Tumas Mikdash V'Kachav. If you were over by it, doesn't mean that the carbon is puzzle. We usually, when it comes to the carbon Talmud, we say the carbon Sibur, you can't use it from that last year to this year. But over here, it was designated already for Yom Kippur or for Rosh Chodesh or whatever, and it's Tumas Mikdash V'Kachav. You could use it later on. You could use it later on. It doesn't have to be, the animal was already designated. So you could use it for that. It doesn't have to necessarily be from that kippur. Meaning the korbanos, regular korbanos sibor that we say, let's say the carbon Talmud that you bring every day, or the carbon Shabbos that you bring on the Musaf for Shabbos, maybe that has to be brought from the one. But if it was designated for here for this yontif, you could use it for another yontif. That could be. Don't forget that we have in the Gemara Rosh Hashanah says that if you say you're going to bring, you promise you're going to bring a carbon, right? So yeah, you can't delay more than 3 regalim. So machlokes, some say 1 regal, some say 2 regal, some say 3. Some say that 3 have to be in order of the calendar year: Sukkot, Pesach, Shavuos, that order. So therefore, you have really 5. You could have even 5, but you could still bring it later on. Doesn't say at the end of the year. Let's have I designate it for Shavuos. If I designate that I'm going to bring a carbon. I'm going to bring a carbon, and I didn't bring it yet. Now I could bring it. So I have 3 regalim to bring it, even though it goes into next year. So there's nothing wrong with that. There's nothing wrong with bringing it. A year after I promised to bring it. There's nothing wrong with that. That could be by an individual. But over here, you could say that I don't think. I'm trying to see if Farshim asked that. I don't know if they asked that. It could very well be that if it's that problem of taking a carbon has to be from the new carbonos is when you're starting out. When you're starting out, you shouldn't use last year's carbon. But if it was already designated as a carbon for Musaf for this thing, then you could just use it again. In other words, you're using last year's carbon. You're right. You're using last year's carbon, but it was already designated as a carbon musaf for Tumas Mikdash V'Kachav. You're just bringing it later on. That's all. You're using it later on. So I don't think that's once it was designated already as a carbon musaf, it's designated. You can't lechatchila a carbon sibor. If you're taking it out, shouldn't be used from last year's money, right? It should be used from this year's karbanos. But if you already had designated as a musaf, it's designated as a musaf. What are you going to use it for now? You could use that. I mean, I'm not giving you a good answer, but that's the answer. And once it was designated as a carbon musaf, it's a carbon musaf already. You could use it it was a carbon musaf designated for Tumas Mikdash V'Kachav, and you're still using it for that. It's last year was last year's. That's not a problem. That's not a problem. L'chatchila, a carbon Talmud that was from last year's. You're supposed to use that from new stuff for the tzibur, but maybe in this case it doesn't have that problem. I'm not sure if that makes sense. I'm not sure if that makes sense, but it could be in this case because it's already designated as a carbon musaf. You can use it. Yeah, the question is a good question. It was bothering me too. Okay. Balzar and Tumas Mikdash V'Kachav Sarah Nasam Efnim. Now the Mishnah said that on let's say we've learned till now that you did these things b'shogeg, right? You became tummy, you went into the base of Mikdash, you forgot, this happened, you didn't know, whatever it was. Let's say you went in on purpose. Al Zarim Tumas Mikdash V'Katshav. You did it on purpose. So if you did it on purpose, what do we say there? The Sar Nasim B'Fnim is Machaper. Assuming you did tshuva, right? You did it on purpose. It's mechaper. Now that's a big thing. So we're saying the Sar Nasim B'Fnim is not only mechaper for, what do we say until now was mechaper for? If you knew you were tamei before, you forgot, you went into the base midrash, and then you didn't even remember afterwards. So we said that the Sar Nasim B'Fnim is tola. It suspends it for you, right? Suspends it until you remember. If you remember, you'll bring it carbon alveore. If you never remember, so the carbon of Yom Kippur, Sar Nasim B'Fnim, suspends it for you. That's what it does. Not only that, but it also atones for something that you did on purpose, and now you did tshuva, you did it on purpose. So this also atones for you. How do we know that it atones for that? The Torah v'chiper ala kodesh v'chiper ala kodesh mitumos b'nei Yisrael umi pishayem l'chol chatosam. What up sham elam rodim? That's you did it rebelliously. You did it on purpose. You rebelled against God. V'cheinu omer melech Moav pashabi. The king of Moab rebelled against me. V'omer oz tifsha livna beisei. Livna rebelled at that time. So that tells me that strange thing. This carbon is machaper. Usually carbon is machaper for a sin that you did b'shogeg. It's mechaper for tumas mikdash v'katshav, even if you did it b'mezid, right? And there are other carbonos like asham is also for certain sins that were done b'mezid. We'll talk about that tomorrow, right? Asham, the 5 of Hashamas, Hasham gzelas, you lied on purpose. Still, that you bring a carbon. So certain carbonos are mechaper even b'mezid, and this is mechaper for mezid. Presumably you did tshuva also. Chatos, it says, you did something inadvertently. If a soul sinned bishgaga, so you see, techata is related to bishgaga, sinning inadvertently. Al shar ve'elos shabatorah, on all the averos, what are all the other averos? We've only talked about Tumas Mikdash. All the other averos, what's mechaper? The sar, the scapegoat, the sar lazazel, the sar hamishtalech. So now, if you look at the Mishnah on days, it seems very verbose. Take a look at the Mishnah, about 15 lines from the bottom of the page, 12, 15 lines. Al-Shara ve'eshem b'Torah, hakalos v'chamuros, the lighter ones, the more lenient ones, the more stringent ones. Hasdonos v'gogos, the ones you did on purpose and the ones you did inadvertently. Hoda v'lo hoda. Well, isn't that redundant? Isn't hoda v'lo hoda the same as zadon and shgaga? You knew about it, you didn't know about it? Asay v'lo sasay. Isn't that the kalot? Creases Mrs. Besin, isn't that the Chamurot? Isn't it repeating itself? It says Sarm Shalech is Machaper. That's what the Gemara asks right away now. Hainu Kalos Hanasei. Why do you say the Kalos and the Chamurs, and then you say Asay Velos Asay? Isn't that the same thing? The Kalos are the Asay Velos Asay, where you only get the maximum you get is Malchus. Chamuras, Hainu Krisus, isn't Chamuras the same as Creases and Mrs. Besin? Those are the more stringent ones that you're going to die for. Hoda Hainu Mezid, isn't if you know about it, that's Mezid. You knew what you were doing. Lo Hoda, Lo Hainu Shogeg. So isn't it redundant? Isn't the Mishnah seems to be repeating itself? Whether they are light, whether they are stringent. Whether you did them b'shogeg or whether you did them b'mezid. Now this bein shasim b'shogeg does not mean you did it b'shogeg and you knew about it afterwards, because then you're chayav a carbon. Let's say you ate chaylev b'shogeg. You went into a store and you ate chaylev. You ate a fat part of the animal that your chayav kar is for. You did it b'shogeg. What do you chayav achatas? Yom Kippur is not machaper for you. If you found out afterwards that you ate the chaylev, you have to bring a carbon, even if it's after Yom Kippur, right? As I said the other day, you have to bring all the women who had children in this world have to bring korbanos later on, right? When Mashiach comes off to bring the base of big dish, will be bring korbanos. You don't say, well, Yom Kippur passed already. You still chayav a carbon. If you know you did something, you're chayav a carbon before you chayav that carbon. Yom Kippur doesn't help there. So what's this b'shogeg that we're talking about where you're not sure if you did the, even later on, it's only like what you chayav an Asham Toli. I'm not sure. There were 2 pieces of meat. I ate one of them. One was chaylev, one was not. People said, one of the 2 pieces was chaylev. Do you know which one you ate? No, you don't know. In that case, you're chayav an Asham Toli. But this sar of Yom Kippur is mechaper for that. So bein shasim b'shogeg, meaning the suffix that you had was shogeg, bein shasim b'mezid. And then he says, osan shasim b'shogeg. That's what he means. In other words, we're not repeating the same thing. When he says kalos and chamuros and hodo v'lo hodo, and Mazid and Shogeg, we're not repeating it, but he says those, whether the Kalos and Chamuros yet, Kalos are the Asay and Los Asay, Chamuros are the creases, but Bain Shas and B'Shogeg, whether you did them B'Shogeg, meaning you're not sure if you did them or not, Bain Shas and Mazid, or whether you did it on purpose, Osan Shas and B'Shogeg, the ones that you did B'Shogeg, you're not sure about, Bain Nodalos Fek, Bain Nodalos Fek, whether you found out that you ate it or maybe you didn't find out anything. There were 2 pieces of meat. If you know if there was 1 piece of meat and it was chaylev and you found out about it, you have to bring a carbon anyway, even after Yom Kippur. But if there were 2 pieces of meat and you ate one of them, you don't know which one, somebody may have told you afterwards, one of those 2 pieces of meat was chaylev. You're not sure. So you'd be chayiv on Hashem totally. But if Yom Kippur passed, this carbon of Yom Kippur is machaper for that. Or maybe you never found out at all. Maybe nobody even told you later on that it was a suffix you possibly ate chaylev. One of the 2 pieces was chaylev. That's what means bein shenodalos faken, bein shalolos faken. Okay, bein shalolos faken. So that's what the mission means to say again. Al shar bein shabatar bein kalos bein chamuros. Bein shasim b'shogig bein shamis. Whether the chamuros or the kalos were done, whether you knew whether you did it b'shogig, you did it b'mezid, and those that you did b'shogig, whether you found out or not. But again, not that you knew for sure. If you knew for sure that you found out that you did it b'shogig, then we're not talking about that because Yom Kippur doesn't help you there. You have to bring your own carbon. We're talking about it was a suffix if you did it b'shogeg. What you did was b'shogeg, but even what you did is a suffix. You're not sure if you did something or not, and whether you may not have even found out about it. Maybe nobody even told you about it. Yom Kippur's machaper anyway, or whether you were told. One of the 2 pieces of meat was chaylev. One was badatz. One was badatz. Whatever it's called, badatz. Shavers, yeah, whatever. One of the badatzes, right? One of the badatzes was one chaylev, whether you found out or not. And then what are the kalos? And then the Mishnah goes on to explain what are the kalos. As below say, what are the chamuros creases of Mises Besin? Right. So in all those cases, it's machaper for you. And Yom Kippur is machaper for you. Let's assume if you did tshuva, right, it's machaper for you. And some say even if you didn't do tshuva. But the machlok is about that. But if it's machaper, this carbon of Yom Kippur is machaper for you. Even if you did mezid, interesting. If you did tumas mixed if it's machaper for mezid, b'shogeg you still have a carbon if you know for sure you did it. Now the Gemara says, what do you mean? Hi essay. What's the case of the essay? Idlo if you didn't do tshuva, zevach rishon toeva. The carbon of a rasha is an abomination. It does. If you didn't do tshuva, you continue in your rebelliousness towards God. So how can this carbon be a chapar for you? It's disgusting, even though it's a carbon for the tzibur, but it's not going to help you. David tshuva, and if you did tshuva, so you don't need a carbon. Call you manami of a carbon asay, even if you did tshuva. Now it doesn't help on a los asay. Still, if you did a los asay, even if you did tshuva, you're still going to get your malchus or your misus bestin. But if it's an asay, there's no punishment per se for an asay. If you did tshuva, that's all you need. David tshuva, call you manami. You don't need Yom Kippur for that. The Tanya overall mitzvahs asay, overall mitzvahs asay, v'asa tshuva. If you over the mitzvah asay, you did tshuva. Lo zaz misham machmochel, and you get mechila right away. All you do is do tshuva. So what's the asay that we're talking about here? I understand the los asay. I understand the mezid. I understand the asham toli. If you're not sure, fine, all that. But if you didn't asay, why do you say an asay? Yom Kippur's machaper manavshach. If you didn't do tshuva, it's not going to help. And if you did tshuva, you don't need the carbon. Omar Zera, but omid b'mirdo. It's speaking about when he's still rebellious about it. The Rebbe goes like Rebbe, and Rebbe says, you know what? Rebbe says that even in a case like that, Yom Kippur is machaper. He says no, zevach rasham toeva is applies to other cases. For Rebbe, the Tanya Rebbe Omer says the Gemara, I'll call it Shabbatorah, ben asachuva, ben asachuva, Yom Kippur is machaper. Rebbe owes machapers anyway, even if you didn't do tshuva. All right, chutz, except for 3 sins. Porikol, when you deny God, kofar beaker. Megal upon Torah, you have chutzpah towards the Torah. You speak insolently about the Torah with arrogance. Umefer bris basar, and he tries to reverse his bris milah. In those cases, Yom Kippur machaper. That's what he means over there. That the zevach Hashem toeva, according to Rebbe, would only apply in those cases, right? Other days of the year. In other words, he'll say that, yeah, the pasuk says Zevach Shaiva, maybe other days of the year, not on those 3 cases. Those 3 cases, no matter what, If you didn't do tshuva, not the Yom Kippur is not machaper. But Yom Kippur is machaper in all cases. When he says Evach Shem Tov is the rest of the year. You can't bring a carbon in the summer when you're still hold by that avera. You're still rebellious in that avera. It goes like Rebbe. My time, that's Rebbe's reasoning. The time says Ki Dvar Hashem Boza. What is that? Zeh Parik Ol. That's a person who denies Hashem. Person who denies Hashem Kofer Beikar or speaks of the Benam Torah. That's mitzvah so hefar. It says Ki Dvar Hashem Boza. That's mitzvah so hefar, and he broke Hashem's mitzvah. Zeh Mefer Bris Babasar. That the ones who tries to reverse his milah. And what does the pasuk say there? He kares to kares. He kares to Yom Kippur to kares to Yom Kippur. Why does Rebbe say that those three averas, Yom Kippur is machap for everything, even if he didn't do tshuva, except for those three? Because the pasuk says he kares to kares. He kares to Yom Kippur, kares to Yom Kippur. Yachal afilu asa tshuva. You might think even if he did tshuva on those three terrible sins, Talmud Lomer, no, avona ba. I only said lo martel bisman shabbanim. I only said if he stands by his sin, if he hasn't repented. If he's repented, then Yom Kippur is mechaper for everything. For Rabbanan, what are the Rabbanan? The Rabbanan who don't say that. The Rabbanan who say what? Rashi says Rabbanan. Where's the Rashi here? A little bit further down. Rabbanan, yeah. Actually, Rabbanan, right even where we are in the Gemara. See Rabbanan in the Gemara, beginning of the line? See Rashi is right there. Rabbanan de Islu Nami B'Shar Averis. Then Yom Kippur mechaper al she'enan shavim. The Rabbanan say that this is other avers, Yom Kippur machap, even not those three terrible sins, and any sins. If you don't do tshuva, Yom Kippur is not machap. The reason why it says that by these three, Lab Yom Kippur, Eli Karis to Karis in general. Back in the Gemara, Rabbanan he Karis Balamazet to Karis Lamaba. That it means that on those three mitzvos, Karis to Karis to come to Karis Lamaba. That's what it means. Why did it tell you about these three? We're not talking about Yom Kippur, because Yom Kippur you have to do tshuva. L.A. Karis to Karis to come to Karis Olam Haba. Sha'af Misa Einam Amrekas Al Shalosh. These three sins are so terrible that even Misa is not mechaper without tshuva. Aval Shar Averas below tshuva. Nami Misa Amrekas. Other tshuva, other Averas, even without tshuva, Misa is even if Yom Kippur doesn't help, but Misa does help. Amrekas Ach Yom Kippur. Aval Yom Kippur below Misa, no. In other words, these three, right? These three on Yom Kippur, you need tshuva. You need tshuva. Without tshuva, it's not mechaper. These three sins are so severe that not only is Yom Kippur not mechaper, Vasharis below tshuva, nami mis merekas achar Yom Kippur. Other tshuva, other sins. If a person doesn't do tshuva, Yom Kippur is not mechaper in general. But Misa is. But these three are so bad. Right? I mean, Kosh said that if you don't do tshuva, even Misa will not be mechaper. That's what it means below tshuva. Aval shara bears below tshuva. But these three, come to the olam, she'af Misa ain't a marekas al shal sheli if you didn't do tshuva. And why did he say avona ba? Shemasa tshuva umeis marekas. That if you did tshuva and then you died, Misa's marekas. Misa knocks that off, even according to Rabbanan. So Rebbe is more makel because Rebbe says that Yom Kippur is mechaper on most mitzvahs, even if you didn't do tshuva, except for those three terrible sins. The Chum say no, Yom Kippur is only mechaper if you did tshuva in general. Those three are so bad that if you didn't do tshuva, even death is not mechaper for you. Even death is not mechaper for you. Yeah, that's what he applies it from. Says Gemara now. The Gemara will pick it up from here tomorrow. Can you really say that our Mishnah goes like Rebbe? The Gemara is going to ask on that. We'll pick it up from here tomorrow. Have a good day.